mechanics locked out by law. Rather than use the reparations, which we apply in most places, we've used the conservative remedy of affirmative action to offset negative action. We got to go out of our way to include those who've been locked out historically due to no fault of their own.
But you still would apply a different standard to the free market with regard to the playing field than you would medical school or the other professions.
Not really. I mean, if you did not have affirmative action, then Jackie Robinson couldn't have got on the field to compete, to play. See, no one would ever recommend that someone have the right to fly a plane if they have not taken aeronautical science and flying lessons. One should have a right to be in the pool to get qualified, because all of us are qualifiable. No one should be in the cockpit unless they can fly the plane. No one should be locked out of flying school based on their race, their sex, or their religion.
No, but should they be helped to get into flying school with by giving them test points gratuitously?
Or it could very well be that you give them compensatory education, or that you give them assistance, that you might enable them to qualify. Of course, that's acceptable.
Well, is it acceptable just to give them free points, the way sometimes they get, I think, in the New York City civil service exam?
Well, of course, that's what we do when people are veterans, for example, and they take an exam to, say, for the post office or for federal civil service. They get 10 points just because they're veterans, and they get it because they were locked out of competition. They were away, say, from regular civil duty, serving a tour of duty. They get some points because they were locked out. If you were locked out based upon military service, if that is a factor, others have been locked out based upon their race, based upon their sex.
I see.
And therefore there must be some appreciation of the historical circumstance.
Reverend Jackson, you're a man who's run for the presidency twice, I think in 1984 and 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And in both those years, you campaigned vigorously in the Rust Belt. I think in Ohio and Michigan. I believe you won the Michigan primary.
Correct.
And I believe you've garnered a lot of votes in Pennsylvania and Ohio as well.
That did.
They used to say of Richard Nixon that he was a leap year liberal. Remember that?
No.
They did. They said he was a leap year liberal. Do you think perhaps if you could be described as a leap year moderate? In other words, when you run for president, you run as an American political leader. But in between runs, do you see yourself as an American political leader or as a leader of blacks?
You know, I am president of the Rainbow Coalition, and we constantly reach out trying to build bridges and pull down walls. And while I am at once an African American, the critical issues of our day are not limited to ethnicity. For example, our need to stop plants from closing and jobs from leaving affects everybody. Our need for fair prices for farmers and fair wages for workers affects everybody. Need for a national health care plan. Need for Europe and Japan to share more of the burden of their own defense, either because they're able and be nobody's after them. In fierce time to reinvest in our country, it applies to everybody. Choosing to invest in prenatal care, Head Start, and daycare on the front side of life, rather than jail care and welfare on the backside, affects everybody. And so while there is a concern for those who have been locked out, who must not be given opportunity, our basic thrust is to move the country from battleground to common ground, because that's the basis for real progress.
Now, in this discussion, I'm in New York City. It's probably not the place where you're most popular in the United States. And
which would happen in New York.
That is true.
Correct.
But you've had your problems here in New York as well.
Everywhere. Yeah.
And some of my callers through the months and certainly in recent days have voiced the opinion that you are somewhat, perhaps observing a double standard with regard to your condemnation of Marge Schott after you yourself made a reference that was considered disparaging to many New Yorkers.
And I faced the public and expressed my remorse, and some people on that basis did not vote for me. Others the next time around did vote for me. And what I did or not, and I'm glad I did express remorse, because I think a sincere heart is significant for a leader to possess. That has nothing to do with how we should relate to Marchot, or how we should relate to institutionalized racism in Major League Baseball. An owner of a Major League Baseball team, to suggest that Jews are money grubbers and Hitler just went a little too far, and to call black niggers, refer to Japanese Americans as Japs, that is morally wrong. The 27 white owners of the other teams determined that her language was detrimental to baseball. I did not suspend Marchot. The other 27 other white owners suspended Marchot and fined Marchot. Now, my concern is that those fined her, those who suspended her, now live by the same standards themselves that they are applying to Marchot. She should not, in my judgment, be a martyr, and she should not be a scapegoat. The institutionalized racism and sexism in football, basketball, and baseball is very apparent and very documented across the board.
I understand. Reverend Jackson, is it helping African Americans to inculcate in them the idea that they are powerless to improve their lives outside of concessions from white people?
Well, it's certainly documented that black people were powerless to stop the enslavement by white people as a matter of law. After all, the Constitution was written. It was written that only white male landowners had the right to vote. And in that period, African Americans were defined in the Constitution as 3/5 of a human being. That status lasted for 250 years. No immigrant group, no other group has known the slave or the 3/5 of a human being status. And then another 100 years of legal apartheid, legal segregation, denied access to schools by law, denied access to health care by law, denied access to jobs by law, denied access to borrow money by law. So you cannot make a decision if you want to be intelligent and fair, where you have a text out of historical context. This issue of race, that is an immigrant tradition. Came by way of Statue of Liberty. There is a slave tradition that came by way of Jamestown, Virginia.
No, I understand.
And people must know that there is a difference between those two traditions, and we have some obligation, given the ugliness of our past, given how blacks, just because of race, were denied access, there must be some plan to even the playing field.
No, I understand that, but what I'm asking is that do you think perhaps you can psych people out en masse into thinking that they are weak and powerless by telling them repeatedly that the only way they can achieve power is through some concessions by other people?
No, and I don't think that's the case. Now, African Americans just have the right to vote in our own country in mass since 1965. In your lifetime and mine, you just have the right to vote for 28 years. For all those years, we've seen the film over and over again of these four guys who beat Rodney King nearly to death. Even Darrell Gates himself said it was excessive force, the police chief himself. And we saw what that represents. Those four police who beat that guy nearly to death, lynching with sticks, they were wrong. You ought to admit that.
I do.
As a civilized person.
I don't admit it.
And
state it.
Those young blacks who beat that truck driver because of their anger and their frustration and their rage were wrong to beat him.
Anger at him?
Yeah.
Why were they mad at him? They didn't know him.
Well, and those four cops didn't know Rodney King.
Well, they knew he was breaking the law, but they didn't. But what was the rage? Where did the rage come from on the part of the four young blacks?
Well, once you get into a rage, or a cycle of racial rage, that's what makes racial rage so dangerous, is that it is irrational. You didn't have to do nothing but show up and got beat. But again, that's no different. There's a biblical story. One time, a man was walking down the street tending to his business.
Yeah.
And two men jumped out and robbed him. They beat him nearly to death. And the Bible suggests that Jesus did not judge character based upon the man get beat. He was not a hero. He was just a victim. He said the rabbi, the minister saw the man bleeding, and he crossed to the other side of the street. And then a man of his own race saw him bleeding, and he crossed to the other side of the street. But the Good Samaritan of another race and another religion stopped and helped him on his way. We would do well to keep on trying to look for these examples whereby we can teach people the value of character, of what it is the Good Samaritan in the Bible, of whether it is the George Halliday who filmed the Rodney King beating, or whether it's the 4 young blacks who saved Reginald Denny, or the black surgeon who operated on him. To me, the great moral lesson learned from these very dark moments in our history is that some people rose above the ugliness of the situation. They rose above it. They brought healing, and they brought help. And those are the people whose examples we ought to embrace.
Reverend, we're going to get caught by the network news. Can you stay for a few minutes after the news?
No, this is enough now.
All right. Thank you for coming to the microphones on WABC.
I want to thank you, and soon I want to talk to you about the Haitian situation.
All right. You want to come back after the news?
Yeah, well, give me a...
Okay. Okay.
It's America.
Reverend Jesse Jackson, who I believe we've reached in Washington, D.C. Reverend Jackson, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Thanks very much for staying over the news.
Well, let me express my thanks to you and reach out to the people of New York City. One of the great hallmarks of American character has been the statement that's on the Statue of Liberty, give me your tithe and free your whole masses if you yearn to breathe free. We've been a haven for people who are oppressed. And we have a rather unprecedented thing happening in Haiti today. We have a blockade locking people into an oppressed arrangement, locking people into the jaws of a military coup. We have every obligation, according to our own principles, to help restore democracy in Haiti, return President Aristide with an economic package. It's the poorest nation in our hemisphere, and to keep upon them a blockade that only chokes the poor, and an embargo that chokes the poor, and a blockade to lock people in who are paying for their lives is simply illegal and immoral and unfair.
Well, I understand that blockade is not the concoction of the United States government, either George Bush or Bill Clinton, but the Organization of American States imposed it.
No, that is not true. That's the OAU that has nothing to blockade anything with. That is a Bush policy supported by President Clinton. And my appeal to President Clinton is to put forth his own policy, his policy. We talked about it last week. It supports sending in UNOAS observers, A, which the military coup resists because they do not want to be observed, stands to reason. B, to restore democracy and return Aristide by a date certain. If we make the same commitment to restore democracy and self-determination in Haiti, we've done to restore self-determination, not even democracy, in Kuwait, that would be consistent. And in our own hemisphere, we ought to do it. There will be major demonstrations this Saturday in New York City by Haitian Americans and by IRS from City Hall, the UN, starting at 10 a.m. on this coming Saturday, and Sunday, a demonstration of 50 to 100,000 people in Miami, Florida, simply appealing to our government take the moral high road and make New World Order work in our hemisphere, starting with Haiti.
Do you want the Clinton administration to lift the embargo, the ring around Haiti, and let the boats come in, even if it means another 150,000 immigrants?
Well, first of all, that's not the real threat. The people who are thereby. And let me distinguish now the embargo from the blockade. The embargo was supposed to be designed to keep goods from going into Haiti so as to strangle the military.
Right, that's why I think it was originated by the OAS.
No, but it's the U.S. embargo. But let me tell you, relative to Cuba, you cannot get U.S. goods into Cuba because the embargo is serious. In the case of Haiti, it is so porous, they're literally advertising U.S. goods in Haiti. And so it has had the impact of stifling the poorest people, making them even poorer, while the smugglers of drugs and materials continue to get through. Because it really was a half-hearted gesture by Bush in the first place. He felt more comfortable with the coup leaders who basic the American trade and the elite in the hills of Haiti than the common people and Father Aristides. President Clinton has the opportunity to seize this moment, restore democracy and Aristides in Haiti, and bring about a real victory for foreign policy in this hemisphere. It's less complicated than doing it in Somalia, or Angola, or South Africa, or Bosnia, or Iraq. We should do it and have a victory within the first 100 days.
But what do you want him to do? Do you want him to allow the immigrants to come here en masse, or to lift the blockade, or both?
First of all, Pat Buchanan suggested last year that we should build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico. We found that to be reprehensible in spite of the fact that thousands of South Americans and Mexicans do come across the border. We said an answer would be free trade, to develop our Mexican allies, not to build a wall between us. Well, if we want to open up the relationship with our Mexican allies and neighbors, if we want to open up access to as many Cubans as can escape, so we cannot have a different policy for Haiti next door.
So you want the embargo lifted and free emigration from Haiti, no matter how many new immigrants must be assimilated.
I think what you must realize is that when Aristide was in power, there was virtually no immigration coming to our country. People are fleeing political repression. If Aristide is allowed to go back home, you solve three problems. One, the embargo, which is soaking Haiti, comes down. The Haiti, which is black and refugees, the repression, it comes down. And three, the military repressive forces leave, and the refugee flow stops at the same time.
Right.
So it makes far more sense to send the leader who won the election 70 to 10. It makes more sense to send him back than to debate should 100,000 be allowed to come.
Has Reverend Aristide been guilty of any human rights violations, to your knowledge?
But they're not documented, and I think whatever may have happened, it did not warrant a military coup that killed 3,000 people. I was in Haiti last Saturday, and after meeting with the general, who is now the coup leader, and then meeting with Bazan, who is the acting prime minister, I went to a place called the Argonne, which is where the boats are made, which is where they leave from coming to Miami. A 5 or 6 week trip where 300 or 400 people are in a boat under conditions worse than the slave ships of last century. And while that, the men and young women were making them and showing us how they made them and how they charged for people taking the journey. One said, "Oh my God, here comes the military," and they jumped off the boat and began to flee. They were not afraid of the military coming to arrest them for making boats, rather for talking to someone. And these 4 soldiers walked up, one with a hand grenade in his hand, the other 3 with bayoneted rifles, each wearing U.S. Army uniforms of fatigues and boots and guns. And Reverend Jackson, why are you here? You see, we're here to see what the boats are made and what the exodus to America began. We went to a U.S. Embassy vehicle, and they recognized those vehicles, and the U.S. Embassy personnel began to speak to them in French and Creole. They held us for about 45 minutes, as well as demanded of the press and all of us that we show our names, identification, and the like. They are not there to stop people from leaving Haiti. They are there to rob them one last time before they go. But as I left the place, my anger, more than any fear of what they may have done, was that if they had, in fact, harmed us, they would have done so with American weapons, uniformed in American clothes. Now, my friend, that is not right. That is not America's role. It should not be America's role, should I say, in Haiti.
Reverend, one thing strikes me. you are an articulate spokesman for an opposition. Certainly when George Bush was in power, and even now, you represent people who are, well, I suppose you would characterize as disenfranchised, and you've spoken tonight, and you've spoken very coherently about the history of institutionalized racism.
I always speak coherently. I'm intelligent, and I think well, and I speak about what I know passionately. So this is nothing new for me to speak coherently. What's your point?
My point is that why are all these Haitians striving desperately to come to a place that you characterize as a nation with traditions of institutionalized racism? Why would they want to come here? There must be something pretty good about it.
Well, of course, there's a lot that's good about America. But we have an obligation to finish the unfinished business, to make America better. America has incomplete business. There is a history of racism and sexism and anti-Semitism and Asian bashing in our country. It becomes our burden to destroy the worst of our tradition and make of America a better place, to pull down the walls to divide us and build bridges that connect us. America is also a wealthy and a blessed nation, and it obligates us to be sensitive to the rights of others. America has a great purpose and a great promise to make room for the lockdown, to be sensitive and caring, the firm self-determination in human rights and the right to vote, the right to participatory democracy. These are the great promises of our country that have always been forces against them. I mean, think about it. When the founding writers wrote the Constitution, as noble as their objectives were, these men owned slaves and had babies by them and would not give them their names. What a contradiction. These men, while espousing these great principles of democracy, would not allow their mothers, their wives, their aunts, their daughters to vote. White male non-landowners did not have the right to vote. Native Americans didn't have the right to live. So they have ideals far above their living. And were it not for the human rights, but for the Bill of Rights 4 years later, this republic would not have stood and perhaps would not have deserved to stand. So starting to make this a more perfect union has been the great challenge. And those who love America the most have fought to make America a more perfect union.
Do you feel that you can empathize with the struggles of people that are minorities, and even whites, people that are not black, as much as you can empathize with the travails of blacks?
Well, I have the capacity to rise to the realm of the ethical, not just the ethnic. There's no doubt about that. I mean, when I brought Americans home from Cuban jail, they were not black. When I went to Iraq, confronted Saddam Hussein and made a strong moral appeal to him, and took the first voyage into Kuwait after the occupation, and brought 500 citizens out of Kuwait and Iraq. There were no blacks in that delegation. They were from France, they were from Britain, and they were from the United States of America. And so in my struggle to bring peace in the world and make this a more perfect union, we are quite capable of being inclusive and not exclusive in our desire for peace and justice.
How do you feel about black conservatives, people like Emanuel McLittle of Destiny magazine, or Thomas Sowell, or Alan Keyes? Can you achieve common ground with blacks who are conservative, or do you think they're in their own world, devoid of any logic?
Well, it's according to what they're conservative on. I mean, for example, I embrace the 10 ethical commandments by which people live. Those are values worth conserving. I remember when I was working about the king some years ago, there were some conservatives who did not support demonstrations. It was the constant demonstrations and agitation and high risk, the loss of life of a few, that made it possible for us to have a public accommodation.
So how do you...
Conservatives would not join those demonstrations. They simply discredited Dr. King as best they could.
How do you feel about...
We marched from Selma for the right to vote. Now, it's interesting that the people who you refer to as conservatives have been prime beneficiaries of the struggles of those who fought back. They now teach in universities. They didn't do a thing to open them up. They now have the right to vote. They didn't march one step for the right to vote. They now benefit from affirmative action plans. Didn't do nothing to get them. So we've made change. We've made progress because people sought the change, not because they sought to conserve a status quo that was too limited.
And yet, somebody like Emanuel McLittle will oppose you fiercely on political issues.
So,
are you saying that he is a beneficiary of affirmative action, and so is Thomas Sowell and Alan Keyes?
You know, a case in point. Thurgood Marshall died last week. You wouldn't refer to him as a conservative, I don't think.
Nope.
And yet, his argument, along with Judge Hastings and Constance Baker Motley, his argument led to the premise of equal protection under the law of the Supreme Court decision. It offset 350 years of slave segregated tinted law. Equal protection.
Should say contrary view politically to the Reverend Jackson, and let me welcome Emanuel McLittle on WABC. I should put him on down here. Emanuel McLittle?
I'm here.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking with Jesse Jackson. Perhaps you'd like to say hello to Reverend Jackson.
Hello, Mr. Jackson.
How you doing, friend?
Good.
You know, Jay, I told you I'm still a little while longer to talk about Haiti.
Yes.
And you searched furiously to find Emanuel or someone you thought who might disagree with me. But you know what? It is so civilized for people to agree or to disagree without being disagreeable. I met with Senator Mitchell today in his office about D.C. statehood, and while we met, he and Senator Dole were in a vigorous debate about family leave. So if it is not newsworthy for two whites to disagree, or Republicans and Democrats to disagree, why is it such a novelty to you to run into two blacks who may have different points of view?
Well, if there's any novelty, it's in somebody challenging you. It's not necessarily in any two blacks. You are not just a black. You're probably the most prominent African-American politician, if not one of the most prominent politicians in the United States, Reverend.
Well, thank you.
And I did not search for Mr. McLittle, but Mr. McLittle has been kind enough to call us, and I just thought it would be interesting.
Well, I'm glad to talk with him. Good to hear you.
Well, one of the things that I'm calling for is because many of my supporters and readers in the New York area tell me that they heard a statement made by you that suggested that Emanuel McLittle was somehow or another a beneficiary of affirmative action and didn't march a step for civil rights in the 60s. And first, I'm not one to make any accusations or disagree with you or anybody else for the mere purpose of disagreeing. I need to hear that myself because this is not the Emanuel McLittle that I know. And in fact, I am troubled by the whole trend that we hear, not only coming from you, but many of those people who pretend to speak for Black America that imply that blacks cannot make it without the liberal arm of affirmative action. Not only did I make it without affirmative action, I never heard of it. I never heard of anything like affirmative action during those years in the 60s and 70s when I burned the candle at both ends to go through school at night, during the day, and work at the same time to support a wife and two children. And nobody gave me anything, ever. And not only am I furiously opposed to that whole notion that every Black American is somehow or another a magical recipient of special programs advanced by the civil rights leadership, but I'm equally as disappointed to hear the joining implication that without help, we can't make it alone.
Well, I would submit this to you, that slavery was a special program, and it was negative.
Yes.
And legal segregation...
It's also 30 years gone.
Legal segregation was a special program, and it was negative.
Yes.
And the courts chose a conservative recommendation of affirmative action rather than reparations for a remedy. You know, affirmative action really is a conservative remedy. What we offer for our other allies around the world, you know, for work without wages, the confiscation of land is reparations. And so I submit to you, we need not have in the sense of shame about affirmative action to offset negative actions. Why is it that most blacks cannot borrow money from a bank for business? It's because of redlining. Well documented. It's negative action. We got public accommodations because in addition to being qualified to use the bathroom of our choice, we had to fight to change the laws that stood against our having them. The right to vote. It didn't just happen because of hard work. It happened because of some early deaths between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. And all of us need help. All these leveraged buyouts on Wall Street. What is that except a letter of intent, letter of credit, and access to capital without cash? That's all that is. You look at the New York Yankees baseball team. What is the New York baseball team except prime property at below market interest? And what is a major league team without public subsidy and private capital? So if that's how we build whole communities, then why should we have any sense of resistance to that system?
Yeah, you seem to be void of the whole notion that in 1993, black Americans are as mature and as developed and as wealthy as other peoples. You seem to negate and always render us to a status of childlike infants, politically, economically, socially, and spiritually, are people who constantly need help. And I am puzzled why it is that your help is always generated from liberal whites. And
I don't think, first of all, I don't know you, but that's not my point. You know, for example, let me share this with you. I mean, how did Europe and Japan make it back after World War II? We made them a Marshall and a MacArthur plan. We made available to them. Just one moment.
Sir, what you did was cut me off.
For development purposes.
And I share a certain politeness with you. And I would appreciate it if you would listen to me when I'm speaking in the same light that I listen to you when you are. And my point is that we are grown-up Americans now, and we lead, many of us, the most powerful and the most wealthy cities in this country are led by black folk. And our police chiefs in those cities are black. Board of Educations are black. And why aren't you standing up for the right of black people in New York who do not want their children to learn about the do's and the don'ts of what homosexuals do in their bedrooms? You talk a great deal about historical wrong. Well, historical wrong is just that. Historical. It is in the past. Much of what you have touted on the air as a spokesman for black Americans has been in the past. You do not seem to be able to realize that many of us have gone way beyond even many whites in this country. Many of us are extremely wealthy, including yourself. You are not exactly a poor man. And from wherever you got your money and wherever you got your fame and from wherever you got your position in life, you have achieved it as a black man. And many of us have made these accomplishments in life. It is time for those of us, whether you call us on the right or call us on the left or whatever you call us, it is time for those of us who disagree with this whole victim point of view to be heard, Mr. Jackson. And it is time for us to be heard in the same right, in the same volume, in the same power that Jesse Jackson's point of view is heard. This is the great thing that I take issue with. You can command the television crew. You can command news almost any day of the week that you want. But as I was listening here on this telephone to the question that Mr. Diamond asked you, why cannot Thomas Sowell command that? Why cannot Emanuel McLittle command that? Why cannot Roy Ennis command that? I say it's because we are not thinking in the same way that the liberal establishment has told us to think. We are independent individuals. Many of us have worked hard for our educations, have worked hard for our monies, and we are who we are. We are not bought. We are not paid for.
Well, you know, I'm on this show as Mr. Diamond's guest.
And I am as well.
I don't know you. And I assume that we weren't here for a dialogue, and you choose to sermonize. Let me say this to you, but you do not know me very well. I would like to know you. I don't know you. But to make a statement that I did not
let the Reverend speak.
To make a statement that I did not in the 60s, you would have to know me, would you not? I command cameras. July 17, 1960, I went to jail trying to use a library in Greenville, South Carolina. July 17, 1980, longer on this debate tonight. Why is that? I'm anxious to do it. Why is that? All right. Because I've been on here for more than an hour already.
Wait, Mr. McLittle, let the Reverend Jackson.
I have some particular interest, in the first line of questioning relative to what has happened and what must happen in the sports industry to open it up, because it is an $80 billion industry. And what's happening relative to Haitians. I'm looking right now specifically on three projects. One, freedom for Haitian people. And two, the ending of discrimination in the sports industry. And three, D.C. statehood. And four, national health care plan for this country. Yeah, that's really kind of what I'm working on right now. Can I share with you what I'm working on, Mr. Jackson? If you're interested. I'm working on the concept that black Americans, and there are almost 50 million of us, we are all individuals, and we do not all hold one point of view about all of the issues. Right. And when you talked about the money that American taxpayers have subsidized white European nations, you neglected to talk about the $1.3 trillion that American taxpayers have given black governments in Africa for the last 32 years. When you discuss the issues that you discussed, Mr. Jackson, you come from a particular point of view, and that is exactly your right. But this point of view is being represented as though it was the very voice of black America. So my agenda and my job and my trust in life, and what the good Lord has laid on my shoulders, is to offer black Americans, to offer this country an alternative view from yours. And when I say yours, I do not mean this in a personal way. I say that there is a point of view that is represented by the black establishment in this country that has painted black America into a corner. Well, I would suggest you talking too long. It's not a dialogue. But sir,
let the Reverend Jackson speak. Mr. McLittle.
There are not 50 million African Americans. That's not accurate. Closer to 30 million. When you need the time that you need to discuss what you want to talk about. And we've not given one.
Wait, Mr. McLittle.
We have not given $1.3 trillion to Africa. We have, sir. It's not true.
All right, let me ask you this.
But wait,
Mr. McLittle. Mr. McLittle.
I don't mind dialogue with anybody. When you dialogue with people in the radio audience, you can make 10, 20 telephone calls. But you are rather possessed with this idea of black on black. And frankly, I am able and willing to talk with people of our persuasion, and I do all the time. And though Mr. McLittle and I don't know him, he does not know me, but I respect him just because he's a person.
You have returned my compliment with a slap in the face, Reverend Jackson. I don't know why you choose to do that. What is racist about, I asked you if you would speak to Mr. McLittle.
But the other people in your audience, I would like to also to spend some time talking with them as well.
Everybody calls me a racist, and I don't even do anything.
I think the act was
What was racist about letting Mr. McLittle speak? I asked you if you'd speak to him.
I guess what I think is that your preoccupation with a kind of black-on-black confrontation as opposed to talking with your broader audience, I think it's the kind of race-baiting kind of problem. Appreciate that. But you have the right to do it. That's my estimate of it, too. I'm perfectly willing to talk with your broad audience about my opinion about that, and I would like to talk with you further about anything you want to talk about.
You mean you'll come back again?
Of course I will.
Well, then you're welcome to come back, but I assure you that I did not... I asked you to speak to Mr. McLittle not out of racism, but out of frankly, showbiz. I know that he disagrees with you, and once he called the control room and asked to come on, I merely wanted to make a better program. It was not out of racism. And I resent that accusation, but I have enjoyed the rest of my discussion with you, and if you mean what you say, you are welcome to come back here any time.
Of course I do. And making a statement to what I think to be a racist act and calling you a racist person, I did not, and I choose not to.
All right.
I don't know you well enough to make such a judgment.
Well, maybe we'll get to know each other next time you come on. Maybe you can even come on live if you'd like.
I will.
Is it a deal?
You got a deal, McNeil.
Okay. Thank you, Reverend Jackson.
All right.
Thank you very much. I'll be back with Emanuel McLittle, who's going to stay with me right after this on WABC. I suppose Reverend Jackson, I think, became a little peeved and thought that perhaps it was racist for me to pit him against a black who took a different political viewpoint. And then we made up, the Reverend Jackson and I, and he assured me that he'd be on the show again, perhaps even live in studio.